The crisp autumn air filled the quiet cemetery as Alexander Morgan, one of the world's most powerful billionaires, made his way down a narrow path. Each step he took caused the golden brown leaves beneath his feet to crunch softly, a stark contrast to the silence that surrounded him. Tall, with salt and pepper hair that only added to his distinguished appearance, Alexander cut an imposing figure. He was dressed impeccably as always, but today wasn't about business meetings or boardrooms. Today was personal. It had been 10 years since he lost his mother, Elena Morgan, the woman who had been his anchor, his guide, and the one person who saw the boy behind the powerful man. Every year, on this day, he walked alone to her grave to remember, to reflect, and to feel something beyond the walls of his empire. As he approached the elegant headstone, a monument that stood apart but wasn't overly showy, just like Elena had been, he whispered, 10 years, Mom. He placed a bouquet of white lilies, her favorite, at the base of the stone and let the quiet embrace him. But today, something was different. His solitude was broken by a small figure, crouched near the grave. Someone he hadn't expected to see. A little girl, no older than 7, sat with tangled auburn hair falling over her face. She was wearing a faded blue dress that looked like it had seen better days. Next to his expensive flowers, she placed a single wildflower, a sharp contrast to the polished world Alexander came from. The girl didn't seem to notice him at first, too focused on her task. When he cleared his throat, she looked up, and Alexander found himself caught off guard by the depth in her dark brown eyes. There was something wise about them, far beyond her years. "Hello," he said, unsure of how to address the situation. Who was she? And why was she here, at his mother's grave of all places? "You're her son," the girl said, her tone calm and steady, as though she already knew everything about him. It wasn't a question. It was a simple, matter-of-fact statement. Alexander frowned, startled. "Yes," he replied, studying her closely. "Did you know my mother? She visits me in my dreams." The girl answered without hesitation. "She tells me stories. She said you'd come today." A chill ran down Alexander's spine, despite the mild October weather. His first instinct was to dismiss the girl's words. Dreams, stories, none of this made sense to a man like him. A man who built his life on logic and control. But something, in the way the girl spoke, the certainty in her voice, made him pause. He crouched down to her level, his curiosity piqued. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Lily," she said, her small hands gripping the wildflower as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Alexander glanced at the bouquet he had brought. White lilies. The coincidence wasn't lost on him. "And where are your parents, Lily?" he asked, concern creeping into his voice. "My mom went to heaven last year," Lily said quietly, her voice softening, as if it were a fragile secret she didn't want to break. "Dad's working. He works a lot. I come here when he's busy." Alexander's mind raced. This child, so young, sitting alone at his mother's grave, talking about dreams and stories. It didn't add up. "What does my mother tell you in these dreams?" he asked, his voice more cautious now. Lily's face lit up, as if she had been waiting for him to ask. "She tells me about you," she said, smiling a little. "She said when you were little, you liked to build towers with blocks, and you got mad when they fell down, so mad that you wouldn't try again. But when you were 6, you built one taller than you. She said that's when you stopped giving up." Alexander felt his chest tighten. That was a memory he hadn't thought about in years, one he had barely even remembered until now. His mother had always told him that moment was when his determination was born. But how could this girl know that? Lily continued. oblivious to the shock on his face. She said, "You're lonely now. You build and build, but you forgot why you started." The words hit him like a blow, leaving him speechless. How could this little girl know such intimate details about his life, his past? He hadn't shared those memories with anyone, not in interviews, not in biographies, nowhere. And yet here she was, speaking them as if they were common knowledge. Suddenly, Lily reached into her worn backpack and pulled out something small and silver. "She said I should give this to you," she said, holding it out to him. Alexander's heart skipped a beat. It was his mother's locket, a family heirloom she had always worn. The very same locket that had gone missing the day she died, had looked for it, asked about it, but no one had been able to find it. And now, here it was, in the hands of a stranger. His fingers trembled as he took the locket from Lily. It felt both familiar and foreign in his hands, and when he turned it over, he saw the engraving, the Morgan family crest. There was no mistaking it. This was real. This was his mother's. But how? How had this little girl found it? "She said you wouldn't believe it," Lily said softly, her voice carrying a wisdom that sent another shiver through Alexander. "But she also said to tell you to remember the promise." Under the willow tree, Alexander froze, his mind racing back to a memory he had buried long ago. A promise he had made to his mother when he was just a boy, sitting beneath the old willow tree in their family's garden. He had forgotten all about it, pushed it away, in the relentless pursuit of success. But now, hearing those words again, it all came flooding back. Lily looked up at him with those deep, knowing eyes and said, "She says it's time for you to remember." Alexander's world tilted on its axis. Nothing about this moment made sense, yet it felt more real than anything he had experienced in years. What was happening? Who was this girl, really? And how did she know so much about him? Things no one else could possibly know. As the wind whispered through the trees, Alexander stood frozen in place, clutching the locket in his hand. One thing was certain. This encounter had changed everything. But what it meant and where it would lead, he had no idea. And that's where the story really begins. As Alexander stood frozen, gripping the locket in his hand, questions swirled around him like the crisp wind that tugged at his coat. How could this child, this little girl, know so much about his past, his mother, and even a promise he had long forgotten? The weight of the locket seemed to grow heavier in his palm, tethering him to memories he had buried beneath layers of success, wealth, and ambition. But now, everything was unraveling, and the center of it all was Lily, the poor girl with tangled hair and a wildflower in her hand. For a moment, Alexander couldn't speak. His mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening. He had always been a man of action, of control, yet here, in the presence of a child, he felt powerless. Finally, he managed to ask, "Where did you get this, Lily?" Her small fingers traced the edges of the wildflower in her lap, as she looked up at him with those dark, knowing eyes. "She gave it to me," she said softly, her voice like a whisper, carried on the wind. "She said it belonged to you, and that I should give it back when the time was right." Alexander stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who?" "My mother," Lily nodded, her expression calm and steady, as though the enormity of her words didn't faze her at all. "She talks to me in my dreams," she said again. "She tells me stories about when she was young, and about you. She said you needed this." The rational part of Alexander's brain screamed at him to walk away, to dismiss this as some kind of strange coincidence, or perhaps a child's imagination running wild. But he couldn't. There was something about this girl, about the way she spoke, that felt Real. Too real to ignore. He glanced around the cemetery, half expecting someone to appear, to explain what was happening. But they were alone. Just him, Lily, and the silent gravestones that stood like sentinels in the fading afternoon light. What else did she say? Alexander asked, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. Lily looked down at the ground, her fingers tightening around the wildflower. She said you're lost, she whispered, her words barely audible. She said you've forgotten why you do the things you do, and that you're lonely because of it. Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. He had never told anyone, never admitted it, not even to himself. But there was truth in those words. Despite all his success, all the wealth and power he had accumulated, there was an emptiness inside him that nothing seemed to fill. He had built an empire, but somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of why he had started in the first place. He had grown distant from the people who mattered most, including his mother, before she passed. Why me? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Why did she come to you? Lily looked up at him with a gentle smile. Because you needed someone to remind you, she said simply. For the first time in years, Alexander felt something stir, deep within him, something he hadn't felt since his mother was alive. It was as though Lily's words had cracked open a door inside him, one he had kept shut for so long. But with that opening came uncertainty and fear. He wasn't sure he was ready to face what lay on the other side. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Alexander knew he couldn't leave things the way they were. He couldn't walk away from this child, from this mystery, without getting answers. He had to know more. Lily, he said, standing up and offering his hand to her. Come with me. Let's talk somewhere warmer. I want to understand what's happening. She hesitated for a moment, looking up at him with wide eyes. But then she placed her small hand in his, and together they walked back to the black SUV parked at the edge of the cemetery. As they drove in silence, Alexander's mind raced with questions. Who was this girl? Why had his mother, of all people, chosen her to deliver such a message? And what was the significance of the promise under the willow tree? He hadn't thought about that day in years. But now, the memory was as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. He and his mother had sat beneath the large, old willow tree in their backyard, and she had made him promise never to lose sight of the things that truly mattered. Family, love, and compassion. It had been a simple promise, one a child could easily make, but as the years went by, he had forgotten. They arrived at his mansion, a sprawling estate that stood as a testament to his success. But as they stepped inside, the grandeur of the place felt hollow. Lily's presence, with her simple dress and wildflower, seemed almost out of place in the cold, polished surroundings. Alexander led her into a cozy sitting room, where a fire crackled in the fireplace. He poured himself a glass of water, offerings, her one as well, but she declined. Sitting across from her, he studied the child, still trying to make sense of it all. Lily, he began carefully. I need to know more. How long has my mother been visiting you? Lily tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. For a while, she said. Ever since I started coming to the cemetery. She's kind. She tells me stories when I feel sad. She said you would come one day, and that when you did, I should help you remember. Remember what? Alexander pressed, his frustration growing. What exactly am I supposed to remember? Lily's eyes softened, and she leaned forward, speaking in a voice so quiet, it almost blended with the crackling fire. What it's like to be loved, she said. What it's like to care about something other than building things. She said you forgot, but you can still find your way back. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Alexander felt the weight of them deep in his chest. He had spent years focusing on success, pushing aside everything else in his pursuit of perfection. But in doing so, he had lost the most important part of himself, the part that knew how to love, how to connect with others. Just as Alexander was about to speak, the sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. His heart raced, and a cold sense of dread washed over him. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones, and in that moment, he knew that the peacefulness of the past few hours was about to shatter. The sound of the front door creaking open sent a chill through Alexander's body. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood from the chair, glancing at Lily, who sat quietly, her expression unchanged. Whoever had entered wasn't supposed to be there. He could feel it. Every instinct in him screamed that something was wrong. He moved quickly, stepping out of the sitting room and into the hallway, his eyes scanning the grand entryway. The shadows stretched long as the evening light faded, casting an eerie glow over the polished floors. For a moment, everything was silent, and Alexander wondered if he had imagined the sound. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness, and Alexander's breath caught in his throat. It was a man, rough-looking, with wild eyes and a disheveled appearance. He seemed out of place in the luxurious mansion, his clothes worn and dirty. Alexander's hand instinctively tightened around the phone in his pocket, ready to call for help if needed. "Who are you?" Alexander demanded, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. The man stared at him, unblinking, before his gaze shifted toward the sitting room where Lily remained. "I'm here for her," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "She doesn't belong here." Alexander stepped in front of the doorway, blocking the man's path. "You're not taking her anywhere," he said firmly, his protective instincts flaring up. "Who are you, and what do you want with Lily?" The man's eyes narrowed. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered. "She's not just some orphan you found at a grave. There's more to her than you know." Alexander's mind raced. More. What could this man possibly mean? He glanced back at Lily, who was watching the scene unfold with an odd calmness, almost as if she had been expecting this. A creeping sense of dread settled over him. "Explain," Alexander said, his voice cold. "Or I'll call the police. Right now." The man hesitated, his eyes darting between Alexander and Lily. Then with a frustrated growl, he took a step back. "You don't get it, do you?" he snapped. "She's been chosen. Your mother chose her, but she doesn't belong with you. She belongs with people who understand what she is." Alexander's blood ran cold. Chosen. His mother. The man's words made no sense, but they only deepened the mystery that had been swirling around Lily from the moment he found her. Was there something more to her? Something he hadn't yet uncovered? He turned back to Lily, who was still sitting, her small figure illuminated by the soft glow of the fire. "Lily," he said, his voice gentle, "who is this man? Do you know him?" Lily looked up at Alexander, her eyes wide and innocent, but there was something behind them, something deep and ancient. "He's right," she said softly. "I'm not just an ordinary girl. Your mother did choose me, but not in the way you think." Alexander felt the room spin slightly as he processed her words. This girl, who had seemed so fragile, so lost, was now revealing a part of herself he couldn't have imagined. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily stood slowly, her small figure casting a long shadow in the firelight. "Your mother needed someone to carry on her message," she said, her voice taking on a strange, almost otherworldly quality. "She saw something in me, something special. I've been waiting for you, Alexander, to help you remember who you are. But now that the time has come, You have to make a choice. The air in the room felt thick, like the very walls were closing in. Alexander stared at Lily, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath him. A choice? He repeated, his voice shaky. What kind of choice? Lily stepped closer, her dark eyes locking with his. You can continue the life you've built, she said, with all the success, power, and wealth, but it will be empty. Or you can follow the path your mother intended for you, the path of love, connection, and meaning. It's your choice, Alexander, but you can't have both. The words struck him like a lightning bolt. In that moment, everything became clear. His mother had always warned him about the dangers of losing himself in his ambitions, but he had ignored her, believing that success would bring him happiness. And now, standing at this crossroads, he realized how wrong he had been. Alexander took a deep breath, the weight of his decision settling over him. He had built an empire, but it had come at the cost of everything that truly mattered. The emptiness he had felt for so long was not something wealth could fill. It was time to choose differently. I choose the path my mother wanted for me, Alexander said quietly, his voice steady. I choose love, connection, and meaning. Lily smiled, a gentle, knowing smile that seemed to light up the room. Then you've made the right choice, she said softly. Your mother would be proud. The strange man, who had been standing in the doorway, gave a curt nod, his expression softening. It's done then, he muttered. She'll be safe with you now. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Alexander and Lily alone in the warm glow of the fire. For the first time in years, Alexander felt at peace. The confusion, the emptiness, the sense of loss, it all seemed to melt away as he looked at Lily, this strange, wise child who had somehow brought him back to himself. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him of the promise he had made all those years ago under the willow tree. I won't forget again, he whispered, more to himself than to Lily. Lily nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. You won't, she said confidently, because now you know what matters most. As the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Alexander realized that the wealth and success he had spent his life chasing were nothing compared to the simple joys of love, family, and human connection. And with that realization, he knew that his life would never be the same again. He glanced at Lily one last time, her figure now framed by the flickering light. There were still so many unanswered questions, but somehow he knew that everything would be okay. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he was ready to embrace it with open arms. And in the quiet stillness of the night, Alexander knew he had finally found his way back home.